I don't think I did anything wrong. I just made one careless choice that changed everything. I got pregnant by my massage therapist, and now my husband wants a DNA test. Everyone says I ruined my marriage, but in my head, it still feels like bad timing, not betrayal. Before we dive deeper into the story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. I'm Mara Lirienne, and I don't think I did anything wrong. I just made one mistake that everyone insists on calling betrayal. I got pregnant by my massage therapist, and now my husband wants a DNA test, like I'm some stranger he found on the street. It sounds bad when people repeat it that way, like I planned it, like I wanted to destroy everything. But it wasn't like that. It started with stress. My back, my neck, my whole life felt heavy. Evan never touched me anymore, not really. He'd pat my shoulder, maybe brush past me on his way to work, but it felt mechanical. Then Silas came along, all calm hands and easy warmth, saying things like, "You carry too much tension for someone so young." No one had looked at me that way in years. I told myself it was harmless, that I deserved to feel good again, that care was different from cheating. When I missed my period, I still believed it was just life being messy, not a punishment. But now Evan barely speaks, and when he does, his words sound like lines from a report. It's like he's building a case I don't understand. The first time I met Silas, it didn't feel like anything dangerous. It was a Tuesday, one of those long grey afternoons when the office air feels thick and even coffee can't keep you awake. My shoulders had been aching for weeks. Evan kept telling me to stretch or take a bath, like I hadn't already tried that. I'd been snapping at people at work, losing focus, feeling older than I should at 33. Ivy, my sister, told me I should book a professional massage. She said it like a joke, but I took it seriously. I wanted to feel better, and maybe, deep down, I wanted someone to notice I wasn't okay. The spa was small, quiet, and smelled faintly of eucalyptus. Silas was the only therapist available that day. When he walked in, I almost laughed at how young he looked. Not a boy exactly, but not the kind of older professional I expected. He introduced himself, voice calm, eyes steady, like he already knew I'd been holding my breath all week. His hands were warm. When he pressed into my shoulder blades, I felt something loosen inside me that had nothing to do with muscles. He asked if I worked long hours. I said yes. He said he could tell that tension leaves a pattern. I remember thinking it was such a kind way to describe exhaustion. The room was dim, the music soft, and for a few seconds, I imagined being someone else, someone light, someone cared for. When the session ended, he handed me water and smiled. I told him I hadn't felt that relaxed in years. He said, "Then you should come back before years happen again." It sounded innocent at the time. I booked another session before I even reached the parking lot. At home that evening, Evan was at his desk, the one he moved into the guest room a few months back, for focus. He barely looked up when I came in. I told him I tried the massage place Ivy recommended. He said, "Good." That was it. No curiosity, no questions, no follow-up. I wanted him to ask more. I wanted him to care enough to be suspicious. Instead, he just clicked something on his computer and said he'd be working late. I asked if he wanted dinner. He said, "I already ate." The distance between us had become routine, like brushing teeth, like sleeping with the light from his monitor flickering under the door. I started going to the spa every Thursday evening. Silas remembered little things. How I liked the temperature of the room. The song I said reminded me of summer. Once, he told me, "You seem softer this week." I laughed and said, "Maybe I'm finally learning how to relax." He said, "Or maybe you're letting yourself be seen." That line stayed with me longer than it should have. I told myself he meant it professionally. But when his fingers brushed my wrist while handing me the receipt, my pulse jumped in a way I hadn't felt in years. At home, Evan noticed small things without saying anything. The laundry folded itself, the dishwasher ran at odd hours, and yet he stayed silent. I'd catch him watching me sometimes, not in a jealous way, more like someone trying to solve an equation that doesn't balance. Once I saw him slip something into a drawer and lock it. I joked, "What are you hiding in there, secret treasures?" He said, "Just things that need order." I laughed because it sounded like him. He always believed in order, in data, in evidence. I didn't know then that he'd started saving things, receipts, calendars, notes. He was building quiet proof while I was busy pretending everything was fine. At work, my coworkers started teasing me about my post-massage glow. I brushed it off, said it was stress relief, but it became harder to hide how different I felt. My friend Callie said I seemed lighter, like I was finally taking care of myself. I didn't correct her. It was easier to let people believe I'd found some magical self-care secret than to admit I looked forward to someone else's touch. I still told myself it wasn't cheating. It was connection. It was therapy. Evan didn't argue anymore. He didn't even try. If I came home late, he'd simply note the time. Sometimes I'd find a small sticky note on the counter. Dinner in the fridge. Don't forget the dry cleaning. Clara's teacher meeting Thursday. His handwriting was neat, even, impersonal. I started to hate those notes because they felt like little mirrors, reflecting back how unnecessary I'd become. Once, I tore one in half and threw it away before realizing Clara might see. I taped it back together, smoothed the edges, and put it back where it was. When he came home that night, he didn't mention it, but I noticed he'd started scanning the counters more carefully, as if taking mental pictures. The first time something really crossed the line was a rainy evening in early March. Silas was finishing my usual session when he said softly, "You seem sad today." I said I was fine, but he pressed again, "You don't have to be fine here." It was such a small sentence, but it broke something. I told him about Evan's distance, about how everything at home felt mechanical. Silas listened without judgment. When I finished, he said, "Sometimes people forget that care can exist without words." Then he touched my hand, not professionally this time. I didn't pull away. I told myself it was comfort. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself 100 small lies, and I believed them all. After that, I started staying a few minutes longer after each appointment. We'd talk, sometimes about nothing at all. Music, books, how hard it is to be understood. He'd walk me to my car, and I'd feel that little jolt again when our arms brushed. It wasn't until he sent a message late one night, "You carry so much, I wish I could help you breathe," that I realized how far I'd gone. I stared at the text for an hour before deleting it. The next day, I pretended nothing happened, but something in me wanted him to send another. He did. Around that same time, Evan started leaving the house earlier. I'd hear the door click shut at dawn, the sound of his car pulling away before the sky even turned blue. Once, I checked his calendar on the fridge. He'd added an event, downtown 10:15 a.m. No details, just that. I told myself it was a meeting. Still, I felt a strange chill, like the air between us had become too still to breathe. Clara was the only one who noticed how different I'd become. She asked one morning why Daddy slept in the guest room. I said he snored too loud, made it sound like a joke. She didn't laugh. Children can sense when jokes are just bandages. Later, she drew a picture for school. 3 stick figures, one smaller one between them, and a cloud over the mother's head. When I asked what it was, she said, "You're thinking too much." It was the first time I didn't have an answer. Silas started calling me Mara in a different tone, soft, like the name meant something personal. I let him. I told myself it was nice to be seen again, to be treated like more than a routine. When he leaned close during one session, his breath warm near my ear, I didn't move away. I told myself boundaries were flexible when emotions were complicated. Later that night, when I lay in bed beside Evan, I couldn't remember if I'd locked my phone. My heart raced for reasons I didn't want to name. Weeks blurred together. Work, spa, home, silence. One morning, I caught Evan looking at me differently. Not angry, not sad, just distant in a way that felt final. He asked if I was happy. I said, "Of course." He nodded once, as if writing it down somewhere. Then he said, "That's good," and left for work. His tone was calm, almost kind, but something in it made me feel small. By April, the spa visits had become something more, though I still pretended they weren't. One night after closing, Silas asked if I ever wished I could start over. I said yes without thinking. He smiled and said, "Then maybe you already have." It was reckless, but in that moment I believed him. I believed I deserved to feel alive again. I didn't think about what it would mean later, about timelines and consequences. I only thought about how quiet my house was when I came home, and how every corner felt like it had been waiting for proof. When I missed my period, I blamed stress. I bought the test out of habit, not fear. It turned positive so fast I dropped it. For a second, I thought maybe I could still control the story. I told myself Evan would be happy, that a baby would fix everything. I told myself the timing didn't matter, that love didn't follow math. But that night, when he asked what was wrong, my voice cracked. I said I was tired. He said, "You've been tired for months." Then he reached for his phone, typed something quietly, and set it face down on the table. I remember the glow of the screen fading, the faint reflection of my face in the black glass, and the thought that flickered through my head before I pushed it away. He already knows. The morning after the test, everything felt louder. The kettle's whistle, the hum of the refrigerator, even the sound of Evan stirring his coffee seemed sharper, deliberate. I hadn't told him yet. I wanted to, but the words wouldn't line up right in my head. He sat at the kitchen table, reading something on his tablet, the faint glow lighting his face. He looked calm, too calm. I watched him for a few seconds and thought about how detached he'd become, how his expressions barely changed anymore. I wondered if he'd already guessed. I wondered if he was waiting for me to lie. When I finally said his name, he looked up without surprise. I told him I'd taken a test. He nodded slowly, then asked, "Are you sure?" I said yes. He didn't stand up or reach for me. He just asked when I'd found out. His tone wasn't angry, but something about how carefully he chose his words made my skin crawl. I told him it was new, that I'd only just done it. He said congratulations, like someone offering condolences. Then he looked back at his tablet and sipped his coffee. I asked if he was happy. He said, happiness isn't the word I'd use yet. That answer ruined the rest of my day. At work, I stared at spreadsheets that made no sense. My coworker Callie noticed right away. She asked if I was sick. I told her I was pregnant. Her face lit up, and for a second, I let myself feel proud. She hugged me, told me I'd be a great mum again, that Evan must be thrilled. I laughed weakly and said he was just processing. She didn't hear the bitterness under my voice. I realized then that I could shape this story however I wanted. If I acted confident enough, people would believe the version that made me look good. By lunchtime, everyone at the office seemed to know. Someone brought cupcakes from the bakery downstairs, pink frosting swirled like tiny flowers. They said it was just a guess for the baby's gender. I laughed along with them. I even posted a photo online with the caption "unexpected," but meant to be. I didn't tag Evan. He'd stopped liking my posts months ago. When I got home that night, he was in the living room sorting through folders. I told him about the cupcakes, trying to sound casual. He said nothing. I asked if he wanted to tell his family or wait a bit. He said, "Let's wait." His tone was careful, measured, the same way he spoke when giving instructions at work. I told him I didn't want this to be awkward. He said, "Then stop performing." That made me freeze. I asked what that meant. He said, "You act like this is a story you can edit. It's not." For a long time after that, the only sound in the room was the slow, steady turning of paper. I noticed he'd labeled the folders neatly. Utilities, bank, insurance, household, things I'd never seen him organize before. I tried to change the subject, asked if he wanted dinner. He said he'd already eaten at the office. I wanted to scream at him for being so calm, for not reacting like a normal person. I wanted tears or shouting or something that proved he still cared. But Evan had learned how to disappear without leaving. That weekend, Ivy came over. She'd heard from Callie about the pregnancy. She hugged me hard and said it was beautiful news. I tried to smile, but she pulled back and studied my face. She asked if Evan was okay. I said he was fine, just shocked. She frowned. He's been quiet for a long time, Mara. This didn't start now. I told her she was reading too much into it, that some men just don't show excitement right away. She said maybe he had reasons not to. I snapped that she should stay out of it. She did, but I could tell she didn't believe me. That night, after Ivy left, I went through Evan's desk while he was showering. I told myself it wasn't snooping, it was self-defense. The top drawers were filled with neat stacks of papers, receipts, letters, and a small envelope labeled household notes. Inside were printed copies of messages, screenshots. My throat went dry before I even read them. The first was a confirmation email from the spa, then one of my appointment receipts, then 2 short messages between me and Silas. They weren't explicit, just familiar. Too familiar. You looked peaceful today. Glad you came in. It helps having someone who understands touch. Nothing incriminating, but intimate in tone. I put them back exactly how I found them. Heart pounding so loud I thought he might hear it through the water. When he came out of the shower, I was sitting on the couch pretending to scroll through my phone. He said, "You moved my folder." My stomach twisted. I said I hadn't touched anything. He just looked at me for a moment, then nodded. "All right." He sat across from me, towel around his neck, hair damp. Then he said, "If there's something I should know, tell me now." I told him there wasn't. He said, "Okay," in that same quiet tone that meant he didn't believe me but didn't need to fight about it either. That calm was worse than anger. It meant he'd already decided something. A few days later, he came home early. I was in the kitchen making tea when he walked in, set his keys on the counter, and said he'd scheduled an appointment for next week. I asked what for. He said, "To confirm timelines." I laughed, but it came out thin and shaky. I said he was being paranoid. He said, "Maybe, but I'd rather be certain." I called him cruel. He said, "No, just careful." Then he opened the fridge, poured himself water, and went to the guest room without another word. I stood there staring at the spot where he'd been, the mug trembling slightly in my hand. At work, Callie noticed again that I looked tense. I told her Evan was stressed about the baby. She said that's normal. I almost believed her. Then I overheard 2 co-workers whispering near the copy machine. One of them said, "Did you see her post? She looks nervous." The other replied, "Maybe it's not his." I froze. My heart started pounding so loud I couldn't hear the rest. I deleted the post when I got home, but the likes and comments had already stopped coming in anyway. That's when I realized gossip spreads faster than truth, and I didn't control the story anymore. That evening, Evan sat at the table with his laptop. When I walked past him, the screen glowed with what looked like an email draft. I only saw the words "follow up" and "requesting confirmation." He closed it before I could read more. I asked who he was emailing. He said, "Just logistics." His tone was polite, distant, final. I wanted to tell him everything right then, to beg him not to turn this into paperwork, but I also wanted to keep my version of innocence alive a little longer, so I said nothing. The next morning, I found a faint smell of printer toner in the air. A single blank sheet sat on the tray. I crumpled it, tossed it in the bin, and told myself I was imagining things. I started making breakfast, eggs and toast, pretending we were still normal. When Evan came in, he poured his coffee and said, "I'll be downtown later." I asked what for. He said, "Personal meeting." I asked with who. He said, "Someone who understands process." I laughed again, too loud. He looked at me and said, "You always laugh when you're scared." Then he walked out the door. That line followed me the whole day. At the office, I couldn't focus. My inbox filled with congratulatory messages I didn't know how to answer. Even my boss stopped by to say how excited he was for me. I smiled through all of it, hands trembling under the desk. When I checked my phone during lunch, Silas had sent another message. "Thinking about you today." I stared at it, then deleted the thread. It was too late for that now. By evening, I was exhausted. I lay on the couch and stared at the ceiling, counting the faint shadows from the streetlights. Evan came home just after 9. He didn't say hello. He placed an envelope on the table, still sealed, and said, "I'll need you to read that soon." I asked what it was. He said, "Instructions." My throat tightened. I said, "You're scaring me." He said, "I'm being fair." Then he went to the guest room again. Later that night, when I finally opened the envelope, it wasn't what I feared. It was a list, appointments, doctor contacts, dates, and a small note at the bottom. "We'll need medical verification once the first scan is scheduled." It wasn't anger. It wasn't punishment. It was a plan. That scared me more than any fight ever could. Evan didn't want revenge. He wanted order. And order, I was starting to realize, was something you couldn't charm your way out of. I tore the paper in half, then taped it back together. I didn't know why. Maybe because I still wanted to believe there was something to fix. When I looked in the mirror that night, my reflection didn't look guilty. It looked cornered. I still told myself I hadn't done anything wrong. I just needed everyone else to stop treating me like they already knew the ending. I told myself everything would calm down once we had the first ultrasound. Seeing the baby, hearing the heartbeat, that would melt all the tension. I planned the appointment carefully, even bought a soft grey maternity dress so I'd look composed, maternal. When I told Evan the date, he said he'd be there. His voice was steady, almost formal. I didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. At the clinic, he barely spoke. The nurse smiled at us and asked if this was our first. I said, "Second," a little too brightly. Evan only nodded. The gel on my skin was cold, the monitor flickered, and then that small sound filled the room. Fast, rhythmic, like a secret trying to be heard. The nurse said, "There's your little one." I turned my head toward Evan, expecting him to smile. He didn't. He just stared at the screen, expression blank. When the nurse left to print the images, I whispered, "You could try to look happy." He said, "I'm looking carefully." On the drive home, he kept both hands on the steering wheel, knuckles white. I said the doctor thought everything looked good. He said, "I'm sure it does." The way he said it made the whole car feel colder. I told him I didn't know what else to do to make him trust me. He said, "You keep saying trust like it's a favor." That night, I scrolled through my phone for distraction and saw that my photo from the ultrasound, just the one I'd texted Ivy, was already on social media. She'd posted it with hearts and congratulations. Within hours, people started commenting. Most were kind, but one said, "Can't wait to meet the little one. Does Evan know yet?" I didn't understand what that meant until Callie texted me a screenshot of a post from someone at work. A blurry photo of me at the spa, from months ago, laughing near the reception desk while Silas leaned close. The caption said, "Self-care is important. For everyone." The comments were worse. People hinted, guessed, laughed. I froze. I wanted to delete everything, to crawl out of the internet. I sent a message to Ivy, asking her to take the post down. She didn't answer right away. When she finally did, she said, "It's already everywhere, Mara." My stomach dropped. I could almost feel the walls of the apartment shrink around me. When Evan came home that evening, I waited for him to explode, but he didn't. He set his bag down, poured himself a glass of water, and asked, "Do you have anything to say?" I started crying, told him people were being cruel, that they didn't know the truth. He said, "Then tell them." I said it wouldn't matter, that gossip always wins. He said, "It only wins when it's right." I begged him to defend me, to post something, to make it stop. He said, "Why would I defend what I don't understand?" and went into the guest room, closing the door behind him. For 2 days, he barely came out. I could hear faint typing through the wall at night, the soft click of keys, the occasional print sound. Once, I woke up to the smell of toner again. On the counter sat a neat stack of papers, stapled, but face down. I wanted to look, but fear kept my hand still. Instead, I opened my phone and texted Silas. Someone posted about the spa. I think Evan knows. He didn't reply. Later that day, the spa called. They said there had been a complaint filed regarding boundary concerns. The manager told me Silas was no longer employed there. My throat went dry. I hung up without saying anything. When Evan returned from work that night, I blurted out, "They fired him." He didn't ask who. He just said, "Good." I said, "You don't even know what happened." He said, "I know enough." I asked if he'd done something, if he'd called them. He didn't answer. I followed him into the hallway, raising my voice. "You ruined someone's career." He turned, calm as ever, and said, "I didn't ruin anything. I just told the truth." I wanted to hit him then, not out of hate, but from helplessness. His stillness made me feel erased. The next morning, Ivy showed up at my door without calling first. Her face looked tired, eyes ringed with worry. She said, "You need to get ahead of this before it gets worse." I asked what she meant. She handed me her phone. There was a new video circulating online. It was from a restaurant 2 weeks earlier, when Evan and I had gone out with friends. I'd been complaining, saying he was distant, that I felt like a single mom already. Someone had recorded me. You could hear me laugh, saying, "At least Silas knows how to make me feel something." The table had laughed. In the video, Evan was visible in the background, sitting quietly, expression blank. The comments under it were brutal. I could barely breathe. I told Ivy it was taken out of context. She said, "Mara, there is no context that helps that." I told her she was supposed to be on my side. She said, "I am, but there's a limit." She left before I could say more. When Evan came home that evening, I confronted him. "Did you send that video to anyone?" He said no, but his eyes didn't flicker. I said, "It's everywhere now. Are you happy?" He said, "I'm patient." I shouted that he was punishing me, making me look like a monster. He said, "You don't need help looking like one. You're doing fine." Then he walked past me, calm, deliberate, to the guest room again. That night, I sat in the kitchen staring at the ultrasound photo. The image that once felt like proof of a miracle now looked like evidence in a trial I was losing. I called my mother. She answered with that sharp tone that meant she already knew. She said, "You always take things too far, Mara. You make a scene and then act shocked when it turns on you." I told her she didn't understand. She said, "Evan was always too quiet for you. Maybe now you'll appreciate what silence really means." I hung up before she could say more. By the next morning, the story had reached my office. The HR manager called me in, said there had been discussions about professionalism. I wanted to vanish. When I got home, Evan's car was gone, but his mug sat on the counter, clean as always. The note beside it read, "Dinner for Clara in the fridge." Nothing else. That night, I noticed he'd stopped sleeping in the guest room entirely. The bed was made perfectly, as if it were waiting for inspection. The apartment became a museum of small absences, his toothbrush gone, his shoes missing from the hallway. I tried calling him, but he didn't pick up. I texted him, "We need to talk." He replied hours later, "We will." Properly. Those words echoed in my head. Properly. They sounded like a threat wrapped in politeness. I barely slept. When I did, I dreamt of envelopes, of blank pages sliding out of printers, of voices whispering through paper. In the morning, I found a new entry on the fridge calendar. Downtown, 10 a.m. I stared at it for a long time, knowing better than to ask. 2 days later, a woman from a law office called me. She said she needed to verify my address for future correspondence. I asked what it was about. She said she couldn't say yet, only that it was personal and procedural. My voice trembled as I asked if Evan had contacted them. She paused before saying, "We're representing Mr. Lirienne in documentation review." I hung up without thanking her. That evening, when Evan finally came home, I demanded to know what was going on. He said, "I told you we'd handle things properly." I said, "You can't do this to me." He said, "I'm not doing anything to you. I'm just protecting what's mine." I asked what that meant. He looked at me for a long time before saying, "Clarity." Then he walked into the other room and closed the door. I sat on the couch for hours, holding the ultrasound photo, tracing the outline of something that might not even belong to him. Every heartbeat I'd once heard felt heavier now, like proof of a lie I couldn't undo. I wanted to believe that everything could still be fixed, that people would forgive, that Evan would see reason. But when I glanced at the hallway, at the closed door of the guest room, I realized there was no anger left in him, just precision, just quiet, calculated patience. It hit me then that Evan wasn't waiting for me to confess. He was waiting for the paperwork to be ready. Days blurred together after that night. The apartment didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a waiting room. Evan spoke only when necessary. He'd leave early, come back late, and every sound he made seemed deliberate, rehearsed. I tried to fill the silence with noise, TV, phone calls, even laughter that felt fake in my own throat, but the air between us stayed heavy, like something waiting to break. My mother started calling more often. She said she was worried, though her voice carried more curiosity than care. When I told her Evan was acting strange, she said, "You've always needed a man who fights back. He's too quiet. Maybe you pushed him too far, and now he's finding his backbone." I told her she didn't understand, that he was acting calculated. She said, "Calculated is just another word for prepared." I hung up before she could make me feel smaller. Ivy came by one afternoon to check on Clara. She brought groceries, but the way she looked around the apartment made me uncomfortable, like she was inspecting it for evidence. She asked where Evan was. I said he was at work. She frowned. "You know he's not, right? He's been downtown every day this week." I asked how she knew. She said a friend of hers worked at a legal office and had seen his name on a client list. My stomach twisted. I told her she must have misheard. She didn't argue, just looked at me the way people do when they've already decided who's lying. That night, Evan came home later than usual. He looked tired, but not in the way people look after a long day. More like someone who's finally nearing the end of a plan. He sat at the table, pulled out a small folder, and began sorting papers into neat piles. I watched him for a while, then asked what he was doing. He said, "Preparing." I asked for what. He said, "Resolution." I laughed, pretending I wasn't scared. "You make it sound like a war." He said, "It's not war if only one side's fighting." Then he stood up, rinsed his cup, and left the kitchen. The next morning, I found a USB drive on the counter labeled by date. Nothing else. My hand shook as I picked it up. I plugged it into my laptop, hesitated, then pulled it out again. I didn't want to know what was on it. I didn't want to see myself through his perspective. I put it back exactly where I found it. When he came home later, it was gone. At work, people had stopped pretending not to whisper. My boss called me into his office and said he'd been advised to create distance until things settled. I asked what that meant. He said, "You've become a distraction, Mara." I told him the rumors were cruel. He nodded, sympathetic but firm. Perception matters more than truth sometimes. The irony of that made me laugh, though it came out more like a choke. When I got home that evening, Evan was sitting with Clara at the table. She was coloring, humming softly. He looked up and asked if I'd eaten. I said no. He told Clara to finish her drawing and go brush her teeth. When she left, he said, "She asked why you cry at night." My throat closed up. I said, "Kids imagine things." He said, "She doesn't." I wanted to tell him that this was his fault, that if he'd shown me affection, none of this would have happened. But the words sounded wrong even in my head. I said instead, "You're punishing me." He said, "I'm protecting her." After he went to bed, or at least to the guest room, I sat in the kitchen staring at the window's reflection. My own face looked older, harder. I thought about messaging Silas, but his number was gone from my phone. Deleted, probably by me in one of those moments of panic when I thought I could still control the story. Now there was only emptiness where connection used to be. The next day, I went to my mother's house. She greeted me with that same smug pity she always wore when I was losing something. "You've made a spectacle again," she said. I told her people were cruel, that Evan was freezing me out. She said, "Maybe that's his version of mercy." I said she was taking his side. She said, "I'm taking the side of whoever learned faster." When I started crying, she handed me a tissue without emotion. "You wanted attention. Now you have it." Her words followed me home like ghosts. I didn't want to admit that she might be right, that somewhere deep down, I'd like the attention more than I feared the consequences. The idea that someone, anyone, still saw me had felt intoxicating. But now I was being seen in the worst way possible, stripped down to every selfish choice I'd made. That night, when I put Clara to bed, she asked if we were still a family. I told her yes, of course we were. She looked at me for a long moment, then whispered, "Daddy says we'll always be safe." Safe. That word didn't sound like comfort, it sounded like a goodbye. Later, I sat on the couch, trying to think of what Evan's next move could be. The apartment was spotless, unnervingly so. His organization had taken on a ritualistic precision. Folders aligned perfectly, drawers locked, passwords changed. I walked past the guest room door and noticed a faint light under it. I pressed my ear close, but heard nothing except the quiet hum of a computer. A soft click followed, like a drawer closing. When he came out a few minutes later, he didn't look surprised to see me. I asked, "What are you planning?" He said, "You'll find out soon." I said, "You can't just decide things without me." He said, "You decided for both of us months ago." His tone was calm, factual. I told him he didn't have to do this, that we could still fix it, that families survive worse. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Not this one." He left for work before dawn the next morning. I stood at the window and watched his car disappear down the street. The silence afterward was suffocating. When I turned around, I noticed something new on the counter. A small envelope, blank except for one line written in his careful handwriting. "I'll handle it properly." The words looked harmless on the surface, but they settled in my stomach like stones. I thought about tearing the envelope open, but didn't. I just stood there, staring at it, realizing that for the first time since this began, I had no control left. Not over the story, not over him, not even over what tomorrow might bring. The morning I went into labor, the sky was still dark. Rain pressed against the window, soft and steady, like a warning I didn't understand. Evan was already awake, dressed, sitting at the table with a mug of coffee and his laptop open. When the first contraction hit, I gripped the edge of the counter and said his name. He looked up, calm as ever, and said, "I'll get the bag." There was no panic, no rush, just quiet efficiency. It almost made me angry. The drive to the hospital felt endless. The world outside the car was grey and wet. I tried to make conversation, to fill the silence, but he only gave short answers. I said, "You could at least pretend to be nervous." He said, "I don't need to pretend anymore." I stared out the window after that, counting breaths and wondering if he'd already detached himself from me completely. At the hospital, the nurses were kind, their smiles automatic. They assumed we were a normal couple, just another nervous husband, another exhausted wife. I wanted to believe that illusion, so I played along. I smiled when they congratulated us, even joked weakly about how fast everything was happening. Evan stayed near the corner of the room, hands folded, watching. Not cold exactly, but distant, like a witness taking notes. When they wheeled me into delivery, I asked if he would stay beside me. He nodded, but the gesture felt more like obligation than devotion. Between contractions, I tried to reach for him. He let me hold his hand, but his grip stayed steady, not comforting. I told him I was scared. He said, "You'll be fine." It wasn't unkind, it was just final. Hours passed. The pain came in waves, sharp and blinding, and for a while I forgot everything else. When it was over, when the room fell quiet again, they placed the baby in my arms, a daughter, small, pink, alive. For a few seconds I felt something like forgiveness. Evan stepped closer, looked down at her and smiled faintly. Then he said, "She's beautiful." But there was a pause before he added, "Let's make sure everything's clear." I didn't answer. I was too tired, too raw to fight. He kissed the top of my head, soft, mechanical, and left the room. Later, the nurse came in with paperwork. "We'll need both parents to sign the birth certificate," she said. I reached for the pen automatically, but she hesitated. "Your husband said he'd like to wait for verification before signing." My heart dropped. I asked what that meant. She looked uncomfortable. "He said you'd know." When Evan came back, I asked what he'd told them. He said, "The truth." I told him he was humiliating me. He said, "It's not humiliation, it's procedure." He turned away before I could answer. The next day, my mother arrived at the hospital, face painted with sympathy that didn't reach her eyes. "You've really done it this time," she whispered. I told her to stop. She said, "He's being calm now, but calm men are the most dangerous. They don't yell, they act." She leaned closer. "You should get ahead of whatever's coming." I said, "There's nothing coming." She just sighed, sat back, and started scrolling through her phone like she was already tired of my story. Ivy came later, holding flowers. She hugged me longer than usual, and when she pulled back, she looked at the baby with a mix of wonder and unease. "She looks like you," she said. I asked if Evan was outside. Ivy nodded. "He's talking to someone by the nurse's desk." I asked who. She hesitated. "A man in a suit." When Evan returned, he didn't mention the conversation. He just asked how I felt, if the baby was feeding well, if I needed anything. His voice was gentle, but it didn't sound like love. It sounded like record-keeping. I wanted to scream, to make him drop that calm mask, to remind him that I was still his wife, not a case file. Instead, I asked, "When did you stop loving me?" He looked at me for a long time before saying, "When you stopped being honest." The third night, I woke to find him standing near the bassinet, staring at the baby. His face was unreadable. I whispered his name, but he didn't move. After a moment, he turned toward me and said, "I'm doing what's right for her." I said, "We both are." He shook his head. "You don't know what that means anymore." When morning came, the hospital discharged us. Evan handled all the forms, his pen moving with steady precision. I felt like an accessory, present but irrelevant. He carried the baby carrier to the car, strapped it in, and drove in silence. I kept waiting for him to say something, anything, but he just focused on the road, eyes fixed ahead. At home, the apartment felt even smaller. The walls seemed to echo. My mother stopped by again, pretending to help but mostly criticizing. "You should have been smarter," she said while folding a blanket. "Men like Evan don't forgive. They plan." I told her to leave. She smirked and said, "You'll wish I hadn't when it happens." Evan didn't come home that evening. I called him twice. No answer. Around midnight, I heard the door unlock. He stepped in quietly, looking composed, rested. I asked where he'd been. He said, "Downtown." I asked if it was work. He said, "No, something personal." His voice was flat, unbothered. He walked into the kitchen and pulled out a small stack of envelopes from his bag. He sorted them, one by one, placing each on the counter with deliberate care. I watched, confused. "What is all that?" I asked. He said, "Preparation." The next morning, he dressed neatly, in the grey suit I hadn't seen him wear since our wedding. I asked if he had a meeting. He said, "You could call it that." I asked where. He said, "The place that decides what happens next." He kissed Clara's forehead, looked at me, and added, "You'll get your copy soon." Then he left. The baby started crying after he closed the door, and I held her, rocking slowly, trying to calm both of us. The apartment was silent except for her tiny breaths. I thought about everything I'd said to defend myself, all the ways I'd twisted truth until even I couldn't find it. I told myself I hadn't meant to hurt anyone, that I just needed comfort. But comfort had turned into ruin. I sat on the couch, staring at the space where Evan's laptop used to sit, the faint outline still visible on the wood. There was a note folded beside the empty mug. My name on the front, written in his careful handwriting. Inside, just one line. "I'll be handling this properly from now on." I didn't cry right away. I just sat there, the words echoing in my head. Properly. It was the same word he'd used before, the one I'd brushed off as calmness. Now it sounded like a sentence being carried out. I thought of him downtown in that suit, of the man in the hallway at the hospital, of the USBs, the printer, the folders. For the first time, I understood that Evan's silence hadn't been surrender. It had been preparation. And whatever came next, I wasn't going to talk my way out of it. The next afternoon, they found me in the hospital lobby holding Clara when a man in a dark jacket approached. He asked for my name, handed me an envelope, and said the words softly, "Court-ordered DNA verification and temporary custody review." Evan stood a few feet away, calm, composed. I wanted to speak, to explain, but he turned, nodded once, and walked out into daylight.